Happy Halloween, Indie Warriors! Old Ghoul Joe here. Welcome to I Dream of Indie Games. It's our favorite time of the year. The leaves are falling, the wind is blowing, the temperatures are cool, but our blood runs even colder. Okay, so I'm a bit of a nerd for Halloween season, and I love me some spooky video games. While many of you may currently find yourselves trapped in Silent Hill or exploring Raccoon City, I'm here to bring you 10 terrifying deep cuts. That's right. 10 horrifically awesome indie games that will scare the living crap out of you. And when I say deep cuts, I mean it, because who likes the same list over and over again, right? So we're gonna have some interesting ones that hopefully you haven't heard of before. Continue on if you dare, but before you do, show your love for indie visibility at patreon.com/idreamofindiegames, where you can gain Discord access to our terrifyingly awesome community and so much more. Join us. Become one of us. Lastly, a shout out to that Discord community, including Flower Angel Grave, Duck, Indie Greg, and Kariston, for contributing many of these disturbing titles to this list today. You lovable sick bastards, you. Alright, let's get into it. First stop, our train of nightmares begins where everything ends. This is actually the last stop. Ghost train's coming, kiddies. The Last Stop released earlier this year to little fanfare and takes place on a subway car. While the ride is short, the frights are everlasting. Players will attempt to spot hidden anomalies. You'll be tossed right into the action with no tutorials at all, and the eerie sound of the tracks will haunt you all along the way. There are 10 stops in total, so spot as many ghostly entities as possible before the ride comes to a screeching halt. In truth, there isn't much to The Last Stop in terms of gameplay, but its uneasy setting and eerie silence evoke a heavy atmosphere that will keep you fastened in until the end of the ride. Instead of testing your puzzle-solving or combat skills, The Last Stop challenges players to pay attention to their environment and rely on their memory. The train will periodically stop, so pay attention and you may just survive until the last stop. This unique release is a great example of an indie developer creating something interesting and different on a small budget, so if it looks fascinating enough to you, be sure to add it to your wishlist or purchase the game using the link in our description box below. The game carries a rather small price tag and is often bundled with some other horrific indie releases. This next chilling indie won't be for those of you who are claustrophobic, that's for sure. This is Lost in Vivo, a nightmarish journey that begins with a service dog being sucked down into a sewer system. You know where this is going. You'll need to go after the pup, but you'll probably wish you didn't once you find out what lurks below. This violent indie isn't for the faint of heart, and will have players encountering freakish characters while taking in the psychotic and maniacal visual presentation. There's a bit of a Silent Hill vibe to Lost in Vivo, whether it be the dreary, dreamlike graphics or haunting musical compositions similar to the works of Akira Yamaoka, but Lost in Vivo also has a vibe all of its own. The story is open to interpretation and has many theories that will lead players down the Reddit rabbit hole, or wherever you go to read theories these days. Just who is living in this sewer? What the hell are they eating? Why do some characters have no eyeballs? These are just some of the questions you'll try to answer throughout this short adventure. The game hosts many inspirations, whether it be video games or classic works of literature, but underneath its complex exterior is a fascinating indie horror release that is well made and belongs in your collection. It'll only take a few hours of your time too, time well spent if you ask me. And by the way, who the hell came up with these creature designs? Perhaps a chilling visual novel will fit the mood better for you this Halloween season, huh? Look no further than Raging Loop, a fantastic visual novel that is available on all major platforms. After an unfortunate biking accident, our lead character finds himself lost out in the mountains until he meets a college student and ultimately ends up trapped in a diabolical town known for its wretched annual feast. Someone must die each night of this festival, and things only get darker from there. Raging Loop does feature branching paths, so your choices will be critical to unraveling all of the world's secrets. Which ending will you receive? Maybe all of them if you have the dedication, as this one runs a bit long if you want to learn everything. If you like social deduction games, you'll probably find a great deal to like about this release. The visual presentation is fantastic, as is the soundtrack. The writing is also strong throughout, and honestly, for as violent as the story is, the on-screen gore is, at least, tolerable. Recommended if you are looking for a spooky read this season that feels interactive and has tons of replay value. At number 7, the Coma games, in my opinion, are pretty underrated. Consider this next entry on our list a bit of a 2-for-1, as I believe you should play both the Coma recut and its excellent sequel, the Coma 2 Vicious Sisters. These horror games feature heart-stopping stealth mechanics and great 2D survival horror action along with fun inventory management. The story follows a student who wakes into a disturbing new reality where everything has been twisted on its head. Your former teachers now want you dead, and so it's time to run for your life and survive by any means necessary. Fair warning here, I highly recommend playing the first game before jumping right into the sequel, only because the sequel definitely feels better to play, particularly with its improved stealth mechanics. There's good lore to be discovered across both games, so for all you lore nerds out there, it's here if you seek it, even if the stories aren't exactly groundbreaking. This series often reminds me a bit of the Clock Tower games, with a heavy reliance on having to hide. Though in the Coma, you need to also manage your stamina meter closely if you don't want to be caught. It's also worth noting that the recut version is an improvement on the original release of the Coma, so that's the way to go if you want to play the games in order and have the best overall experience. The beautiful visuals and sound design across this series work very well, and I can't recommend the Coma games enough for good, campy, and sometimes intense fun. Now I know that many of you remain salty about the cancellation of PT, and hey, I'm right there with you. But at least its cancellation spawned plenty of great horror games in a similar style, right? Take Infliction Extended Cut for example, a game that didn't review particularly well, but is actually a fun, albeit brief first-person horror experience from a small indie dev. Infliction began as a Kickstarter project initially, and has you playing as Gary, who gets a call from his wife, who can't seem to locate her missing plane ticket. Seems innocent enough at first, right? Well, wrong. Ultimately, this leads to a nightmare situation in your home, where nothing is as it seems. The gameplay is mostly about exploration. You won't find much combat here, though there is a touch of stealth and a good amount of puzzle solving throughout. The puzzles aren't all that tricky, so if you aren't a fan of brain benders, fear not. What should scare you are the spirits that will periodically hunt you down. Players will need to rely on light to get rid of the spirits, which is a cool little mechanic if you ask me. If you're a fan of the Fatal Frame series, you'll also get a kick out of the camera that can be used to open up pathways throughout Infliction. It is a slow, brooding game that has plenty of chills and thrills, even if it can feel a bit like a haunted house simulator at times. Sadly, the Switch version doesn't run all that great compared to the others, so I would recommend another platform if you have the option. Otherwise, you're gonna have some spooky performance. However you end up playing Infliction Extended Cut, it's a wonderful addition to your library, and the perfect game to play in front of a live audience this Halloween. All aboard! Another train game is our next stop on this list, and it's a game that I try to shout out as often as possible because I feel it is an extremely underrated release. Return One Way Trip doesn't have the catchiest name, but it's a very fun 2D adventure horror experience with plenty of entertaining puzzles. If you go into Return expecting a survival horror game, you may be disappointed in that regard, as the puzzles are the central focus. This can almost feel like a point-and-click adventure game at times. Things will start out innocent enough, with a group of college kids heading out into the woods to celebrate graduation together. You probably know where this is going too, right? Lead character Saki ends up finding a mysterious love letter made out to her, which pisses her boyfriend right off and sends the group storming off in different directions. You'll eventually encounter a train, and this is where the spooky fun really begins to ramp up. The haunted train has a great lore around it and works as the perfect setting for the simplistic gameplay. You won't find any combat here, which I personally found a bit refreshing for this release. Most of the puzzles are fun to solve too, and not overly difficult. At times throughout the story, you'll switch between the past and the present, which is a fascinating way to see the history of the haunted train you find yourself aboard. I enjoyed the different character interactions and loved the pixel art on this release. The portrait art isn't quite as good as the rest of the visual presentation, but it's a small complaint. Many people don't realize this, but the game did manage to get a sequel that came out to almost no fanfare whatsoever. I haven't played it myself, but have sadly heard it isn't as good as the original. But at the least, I can confirm that Return One Way Trip is a great horror romp worthy of your time. At number 4, here's one you may not have heard of, the very unique ER Patient Typhon. This little indie has a great atmosphere to it, despite the bizarre art style that almost reminds me a bit of that classic MTV show Daria. Don't let the art fool you though. Patient Typhon is terrifying, opening on our lead character having just undergone some sort of operation, potentially against her will. You have no arms as you explore this mysterious asylum. A doctor is filling you up with meds, drugging you for unknown reasons. However, you'll gather little hints and clues the more that you explore. Most of the gameplay is very simple and immersive, though admittedly, the movement speed is not incredibly fast in this game. Even still, there's some really clever puzzles here, even if they aren't all created equal. Also, expect a bit of stealth that can lead to some insane, vicious death animations worth checking out. It's not perfect, but I feel like it's worth having a visit to this ER because there just aren't many games like this, and the story is quite fascinating. The twisted sound design and atmosphere will have the majority of players looking past many of its shortcomings. This developer also went on to create Anglerfish, which has been met with very positive reception since its release in 2022. Number 3 goes out to all you David Lynch fans out there. Describing Paratopic is, well, challenging. Your goal, if this game can be defined as having goals, is to smuggle VHS tapes, but there's much more going on here outside of the typical video game stuff. It is a first-person horror game at its heart, and one of the few games I've played that left me speechless. The story is pretty nonsensical, the art is wild, the gameplay nearly non-existent, and yet this is kind of what makes Paratopic endearing. Gameplay is from the first-person perspective and wildly shifts between scenes at breakneck speed. The game also needs to be completed in a single session, but thankfully comes in at under an hour. In fact, if Paratopic had gone on any longer, I may have hated it. But as it stands, I think it's an unsettling indie that leaves you with more questions than answers, and for better or worse, it's memorable. If you have enjoyed art films in the past, there's something worth exploring in Paratopic, even if it won't immediately be apparent what that something is. At number 2, we have Black Book. I will admit, I'm not much for card battlers, but the addictive and stylish gameplay loop that Black Book offers made me, for a few fleeting moments, a believer in the genre. And when I say style, by God, just look at how gorgeous this game is. Black Book has a super creepy gothic vibe that many games have attempted, but not all have been successful at achieving. It's not just about the looks in Black Book though, as the adventure elements are engaging, and the card combat does enough to stay entertaining, despite the fact that I'm not a fan of card games. There's a lot to learn here throughout the story that involves witches, love, and betrayal. You'll use the Black Book to try to raise a lost loved one from the dead. While the explorative elements of Black Book don't throw players many curveballs, the card gameplay involves attacking and defending while trying to read your enemy's next move. While challenging, the amount of accessibility options available in Black Book mean that anyone will be able to enjoy the experience, even if they're mostly in it for the story and atmosphere as opposed to the gameplay. Just don't be intimidated and take your time. The puzzle elements often rely on context clues, and you even have little demon dudes to send off on quests. That is to say, the gameplay variety is decent. So yes, it'll take some learning, but Black Book's dark and exciting world is worth the extra effort if you ask me. Sure, the dialogue isn't amazing, and the game has its shortcomings, but despite all of that, I still wanted to sink hours into it, and that says something. There's a lot of game here too for the price, especially since it goes on sale quite often. Alright, I know this says number 1, but stick around for a bonus because we have a really fun little extra piece of content after this release. But next, we enter the madness, the Source of Madness. Source of Madness is a jaw-dropping game to view in motion, but it's also a great gameplay experience with some truly haunting and unforgettable creature designs. Now I know AI has its detractors, but I think Source of Madness is an example of it being used in an effective way, with the monsters being procedurally generated and powered by a neural network. The results are honestly downright disturbing. Even beyond this, Source of Madness has an incredible Lovecraftian world worth exploring. Inspired by Diablo 2, the story is a bit obscure, but it also feels like the world tells its own story just through the exploration. Combat is satisfying too, with plenty of equipable items that can make all the difference in your runs. While roguelites aren't for everyone, Source of Madness stands out from the crowd a bit. It's a freaky, awesome aesthetic that will make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, and a fun experience on top of that. Alright, Halloween bonus time, trick or treat, open up your basket. I'm gonna dump in another game. Now this isn't a recommendation per se, it is not part of the main list, but I thought with the Halloween theme and all, the fascinating history behind this game, well, it was worth talking about for this video. And this is Spookware, a troubled title that came to us from Beeswax Games. The best way to describe Spookware is an indie version of WarioWare with a silly Halloween skin. You'll take on a variety of horror-themed microgames in the name of the Skelebros. The microgames are often clever, and personally, I found the writing in this release to be hilarious at times. Well, what we got of it anyways. Here's the catch with Spookware. While it is an absolute riot to play, the game was never completely finished, buried alive. Apparently, the developer would have received additional funding from their publisher to complete the final few chapters of the game had it sold well enough, which, unfortunately, it did not. At the least, the price was permanently reduced, though I would still place Spookware into the buyer beware category, simply because you are currently buying an unfinished game, whether it be at a reduced price or not. It's kinda like that weird stuff they pulled with Azura's Wrath back in the day, having the true ending as a separate DLC, but not done intentionally, and well, to date, never actually completed. Yeah, that's a real thing that happened, by the way, and I was the victim of it. The frustration here, though, is that Spookware is really great from what did come out. The hilarious story and microgames are so damn enjoyable, it makes all of the head-scratching decisions and occurrences throughout the project a little bit easier to swallow. The visuals are lovely to look at, especially since the dev undid an awful wavy filter that it initially launched with. It's just downright fun. Unfortunately, I do feel for all those players that paid the full price under the assumption it would be a complete experience eventually, but it was buried all too soon. Some potentially good news though? Could it rise from the grave? The developers have now managed to get the rights to Spookware back from the publisher, meaning that it could finally be finished all these years later. Potentially. Right now, the developer is working on a new release called No Players Online, but haven't ruled out adding the final chapters of Spookware once they finish this latest project. So here's to hoping, everybody. Weird history aside, what's here is undeniably entertaining. So did you find any awesome indies to play this Halloween on our list? What are some of your favorite horror indie games? Let us know in the comments below. Happy Halloween, and see you on the channel for more indie delights.